All right, so we are going to continue on in AP History, chapters 35 and 36, and hopefully you guys are getting these assignments done, turning in your worksheets. I already posted on Google Classroom when your next set of worksheets are going to be due, and you guys are just going to have to keep plugging along and reading your book and answering the content questions that way. But for the foreseeable future, I'm going to work with this because I know it works, and I've already been using it for other classes. So here we go, post-war problems. Demobilization. As we said, almost 5 million men are going to be returning back to life, and that's going to have a huge impact on the economy. And it was tough for a lot of them to find jobs because they're going to try to get back to some type of normalcy, but their jobs were taken. A lot of employers had to rehire people, specifically factories had to rehire people, and you weren't guaranteed to get a job when you came back from war, which seems a little bit unfair, but at the same time, what do you do if you're a factory owner? Those who did find jobs often took them from women and African Americans. Minorities were usually left out in the cold again, which is truly unfortunate. With the production of war goods falling off, the economy also drops off. European goods were back on the market and free trade was happening again. So prices are also dropping for everybody. However, the consumers went on a large spending spree. They had been saving money because they didn't know what was going to happen with the war. So a lot of people had money. And the economy grew from around 1920. Economy grew around 1920, but by 1921, another recession hit, and almost 10% were unemployed, which isn't going to look like a big deal in about a decade. The Red Scare did take place. You guys probably remember some of this stuff from ninth grade. Communists had taken over Russia, and the unfamiliar created fear in the U.S., and they called this the Red Scare. Red is usually almost always associated with communism. And xenophobia was also another result of this. Xenophobia is the idea that your country and your culture are by far the best, and you are terrified of other countries. You do not like them. You think that your country and culture is better than theirs, and you don't want anything to do with their country and their culture. Immigration restrictions were the natural outflow prompted by the American people and the government. The Palmer raids took place from 1919 to about 1920, about a year-long process this was, and a series of unexplained bombings caused Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer to establish a special office led by J. Edgar Hoover, who's going to be the future leader of the FBI, to gather information on radicals. It would be anarchists, socialists, labor agitators, but these Palmer raids, one of the things that actually happened was A. Mitchell Palmer had part of his house blown up, and they tied it to, they thought, communists, when it might not have been them. But from late 1919 to early 1920, over 6,000 people were arrested on limited evidence. Most were foreign-born, and some were deported. This is a natural outflow of what xenophobia can be. And for the most part, the fanaticism faded quickly, but the thoughts were in the back of people's minds through the 1920s. In the 1950s, we're going to talk about this with the McCarthyism and talk about how he was accusing people of being communists. If you want to know how that would apply today, that would be people that post 9/11, people from Middle Eastern descent, were oftentimes looked at very, very differently post 9/11. Labor conflict. Prior to the war and during the war, unions made great stride for workers. People began to start liking and getting used to unions. However, a series of strikes, as well as fear of extremists and revolution, changed public opinion. Unions were usually associated with socialists because they want equal pay and they want everyone to kind of be treated the same. And so that kind of created more fear for unions because people associated them with the socialists and the communists. In Seattle, 1919, 60,000 union members joined a shipyard worker asking for higher pay. Troops were called out, but overall there was really no violence, which is good. However, in 1919, police actually went on strike because some police officers were fired for trying to unionize. And the Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge eventually did break this, mainly saying that this is for the public safety. You can't go on strike. He eventually becomes president. We've talked about this, but became pretty famous for his involvement in settling this conflict. U.S. Steel Corporation also went on strike. Federal troops were called out, and after a decent amount of violence, the strike was broken. Again, just know that you're having this labor conflict going on fairly frequently during this time period, going all the way back to the 1860s. And even today, you still have labor conflicts, you still have people going on strike. We experienced that last fall, even around here. In the 1920s, The election, Republicans chose Warren Harding from Ohio, who claimed he wanted to return America to normalcy, meaning post-World War I normalcy. Democrats, James Cox, who readily supported the League of Nations, was their guy who ran. FDR was actually his vice presidential candidate. Harding ended up winning by a landslide, mainly because I think people were probably sick and tired of Woodrow Wilson and the Democrats at this point in time, which seems kind of weird because you didn't really think the Democrats were doing anything wrong, but if you hit a recession, that's going to be a big deal. Through the 1920s, 3 Republican presidents would control the executive branch, and Congress would continue to be solidly Republican. That's a big fact. I'd highlight that. As far as Harding's presidency, the cabinet, Charles Evans Hughes was the Secretary of State, did a lot of stuff foreign policy-wise. Herbert Hoover was his Secretary of Commerce, again, future president there. Millionaire Andrew Mellon was his Secretary of Treasury. That's kind of cool. When you go down to downtown Pittsburgh and those areas, you'll see Mellon University. This is where that name was from, but he did deal a lot with finances in post-World War I Europe and post-World War I America. William Howard Taft was his Supreme Court Justice. Again, becomes the only president to serve as a Supreme Court Justice. That's pretty cool, and all of these were seen as great decisions by Harding. His domestic policy, more or less, he just did whatever Congress wanted. He agreed to reduce the income tax, which obviously makes consumers very happy. He increased tariff rates under the Ford-Macomber tariff, which again would assist our American businesses in protecting them. He established a Bureau of the Budget, which said all government expenditures had to be placed in a single budget for Congress to review and vote on. He's trying to curb spending, is what he's trying to do. One kind of controversial thing that he did do is he pardoned Eugene Debs, who had been jailed for his involvement with being in disagreement with the government, being a socialist, and being outspoken against the U.S. government. Scandals. He selected very dishonest and corrupt men to fill positions. A lot of people think that his administration, had he lived through his whole entire administration, would have been more corrupt than President Grant, which we've talked about ad nauseum at how bad of a president he was. The two that I want you to know would be Albert Fall and the Teapot Dome scandal. Albert Fall granted oil leases in Wyoming, and that was supposed to be used for the military. And he felt like the military wouldn't find out, but eventually they did. And as he's selling government oil to business people to make a profit, he obviously gets in trouble and goes to jail. Harry Daugherty, which was his attorney general, took bribes to not convict criminals. Evidently, that's frowned upon in the government. As far as his death, shortly before these scandals were uncovered publicly, Harding died suddenly while traveling out west. A lot of people are kind of wondering, like, what happened. There's people that believe that it was food poisoning. Other people believe that it was heart attack. What was kind of crazy is his wife did not want his body to have an autopsy, which made kind of people a little bit, skeptical about what happened. But there's not really a true conspiracy theory there. But he passes away, and Calvin Coolidge takes over. Now, Calvin Coolidge, as he takes over, his popularity was based on his dealings with the Boston police strike. He was nicknamed Silent Cal, as he was not one for words. The business of America is business. That is a phrase that you need to be thinking about when you think about the 1920s. And this showed many that he was going to be pro-business and sort of hands-off. He didn't want to have a lot of business regulations. He always felt like if the consumers really wanted a product, let the businesses do it. And if the consumers don't like the businesses, well, then they won't purchase it and those businesses will close down. So again, highlight that phrase, the business of America is business. Coolidge was chosen to run for the Republican Party in 1924. He was chosen mainly because the economy was doing really, really well, and there was relatively low amount of controversy within the White House. The only thing his government kept a close eye on was the budget. They cut federal spending to the bare minimum. Coolidge also vetoed Republican bills such as bonuses for World War I vets, and he voted a bill that would help farmers as their crop price, and he vetoed a bill that would help farmers as their crop prices fell. So again, he wanted to bring the government spending to a halt, which hopefully would make more money in the long run for everybody else. Coolidge declined to run for presidency in 1928. Many believed he knew the economy was about to take a large drop-off. There was kind of a word from his daughter about that he already knew. And Republicans turned to Herbert Hoover, who seemed like a great candidate, minus the fact he'd never ran for public office. He was smart, organized, and also served for 3 presidents, so we felt like the political experience was there as far as how the government ran, but he just It doesn't turn out to be a great politician. The Democrats chose Alfred Smith from New York. He was a Roman Catholic, and he was anti-prohibition. They actually nicknamed him Alcohol Smith to kind of take a little shot at him. But Smith appealed to many immigrant voters in the cities, mainly because he was Roman Catholic, and mainly because he had a little bit of history from, I believe, the Irish, if I remember correctly. But he did not appeal to conservative Protestant voters. It's hard to get a Roman Catholic candidate in at this point in time. Republicans leaned on what they called the Coolidge prosperity, which Hoover promised to extend. And Hoover won in a landslide and was even able to flip voters who were usually Democratic. I would highlight this: the prosperity blinded people as to who they perhaps would have voted for. Not saying that Alfred Smith would have been an amazing candidate, but what we are saying is, as I've told you guys in government class, a lot of times when people have money and unemployment is low and gas prices are low and prices are low and people are able to have spending money and free time, a lot of times people don't want to change, and people want to stick with those presidents as much as they possibly can during that time period. Anyway, that's going to conclude this first section. I'll continue on in section 3 in our next video, and that should be about 2 videos today is what my plan is, and hopefully you guys can watch this and get rolling on it. So, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.